Please welcome Jennifer McMahon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming out on this yet another wintry mix night. And thank you to Todd and all the wonderful folks here at Phoenix Books for having me. This is great. So I thought what I'd do is tell you a little bit about the winter people and read a little part. I picked something nice and creepy for tonight. And then if you have questions, I can do my best to answer them. So we'll just go and get started. I think I'll start with a question. And it's the question that's kind of at the heart of the winter people and ties everything together. What if you lost someone you loved? A husband, a wife, a child? And what if there was a way to bring them back? Would you, no matter what the consequences would be? And that's kind of that's the question at the heart of the book. Winter People is my 6th kind of dark, creepy suspense novel, and it is definitely the darkest and creepiest yet. And I definitely gave myself the creeps writing it. If you're a writer, or if you go to writing workshops or take any writing classes, you hear this thing over and over: write what you know, write what you know. And my own little private motto is write what scares you. And I'm drawn to write about the things that frighten me, and that's definitely what I did. I went to some dark places in the Winter People and revisited some old fears and came up with some new ones. So I had a lot of fun writing it. The Winter People begins in 1908 in the fictional town of West Hall, Vermont, when Sara Harrison Shea, a farm wife, is found brutally murdered in the field behind her house. And this is only weeks after the death of her beloved little girl, Gertie. And as we get into the book and we're reading through and we read Sarah's diary, we come to realize that in the final days of her life, she came to believe that she had found a way to bring her little daughter Gertie back. And then in the present day, we have 2 sisters living in Sarah's old farmhouse. We have Ruthie and her little sister Fawn. And one morning they wake up to find their mother has disappeared mysteriously without a trace. And they're kind of searching through the clues, searching through the house, looking for clues, trying to figure out what happened to their mom. And they come across Sarah's diary, and they start on this path trying to figure out what happened to their mom and where she could be. And eventually they come to realize that their mother's disappearance is tied to a very kind of terrifying secret over a century old. The Winter People came to me, like a lot of my books, from kind of a series of things. I think that writers are a little bit like magpies. You know, we look for shiny objects to go out and gather and bring back to the nest that becomes the book. And for me, the first shiny object moment was a game that I played with my daughter Zella, who is here, and I actually dedicated the book to her because she was the original inspiration for the modern day storyline of Ruthie and Fawn. So several years ago, Zella had me play this game, and her games at the time were kind of like improv exercises in an acting class. She would give us each a character and a situation and a setting, and she'd say, go. And this day's game went something like this. She said, here's the deal. We're sisters. You're 19, I'm 7. You wake up one morning and I'm in bed with you and I say our parents are missing. And I'm like, wow, missing? That's terrible. That's so sad. What happened to them? And she said very seriously, they were taken into the woods. And I'm like, oh, that's terrible. And then she said very matter-of-factly and shrugged her shoulders and said, sometimes it just happens. And so that was definitely one of those shiny object moments. And I ran and grabbed my notebook and I said, Zella, this belongs in one of Mommy's books. This sounds like the beginning of one of Mommy's books. And she got all excited. She's like, yeah. And I was like, yeah. So we got out the notebook and she's throwing all these ideas at me. And she said, maybe there's a secret door in the woods. And I'm like, yeah, I'm writing secret door. And she said, maybe there's a monster. And I'm like, yeah, maybe it's a monster. So I'm writing monster. And then she said, maybe it's Bigfoot. Maybe it's aliens. And I'm writing all this down. And I'm getting all these ideas. And then I thought about it for a few days, and I didn't really have enough to start anything. I didn't know where I was going to go with it. So I put it away, and that's the really great thing about ideas, is that you can put them away and save them for later, save them for another time. And I have this idea, kind of my own little crazy idea, that when you put an idea away, that maybe it acts like a magnet and can draw other ideas to it. And so I put the idea away and didn't really think about it. And I went on with my life, and I wrote my next book, which was about a serial killer who cut women's hands off. And that did great, and I got all caught up in that. And then the time came to work on this new book. And all I had was that I wanted to do something with a historical aspect. And I started writing this book about a guy who was a Civil War soldier in the Union Army marching home from the Civil War. And I just had this very clear vision of him in my head. And I just start writing, and that's kind of how I start writing. I just get a nice single idea and I just go with it. So I had this guy, and his name is Martin, and he's a soldier in the Union Army, and he's marching, and And I'm not sure why he's marching. I think maybe he's gone AWOL and something terrible has happened to him, and he's having all these flashbacks about his childhood and his wife. And I'm going along, and I realize I don't know a whole lot about the Civil War. How am I going to weave all these details about the Civil War into the story? So I start doing research, and I start reading about the Civil War. And then one day I decided to watch the Ken Burns Civil War documentary. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but if you haven't, it is amazing. It's a really powerful, incredible piece of filmmaking. It's fantastic. So I'm watching this documentary, and there's this tiny little bit in there, and here's another one of those shiny object moments. There's this tiny little bit in there about Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln's young son dying in the White House. And Mary Todd was absolutely grief-stricken. And after she claimed that she believed that she saw his ghost, and he came and visited her in her bedroom, and she became a spiritualist and started having seances in the White House. And there wasn't a whole lot about it. But all of a sudden, my whole Civil War soldier idea just went out the window. I was like, no, that's not what I want to write about. I want to write about a woman who is a spiritualist at the turn of the century in Vermont. And it just hit me completely. And so I took my Civil War character, Martin, and I moved him ahead a few years, and I turned him into the husband of my spiritualist, Sara. And I started writing, and I was so into Sara, and I started reading, and then I put away the Civil War books, and I got all these books out about spiritualism at the turn of the century, and I'm reading about spiritualism, and I'm reading about seances and table knocking and all this great, fascinating stuff, and I'm writing, and I decide that Sara's going to have a child, Gertie, who's going to die in this horrible, tragic way, but Sara will believe that she can communicate with her. And I wasn't sure what was going to happen beyond that, but I started writing, and then this crazy thing happened, because I'm not a planner or a plotter, and sometimes I think that when I start out and I have these ideas for characters in the way that they're supposed to act and the things that they're supposed to do, and they have a big surprise up their sleeves for me. They don't always do what I want them to do. So I think I'm writing about the spiritualist, and so I'm writing a diary entry from her point of view one day, and I get this line, and the line is, the first time I saw a sleeper, I was 9 years old. And I went, whoa! And I got chills, and I just about fell out of my chair. I'm like, what's a sleeper? And it scared me, and I wanted to know, and I knew that I had to keep writing to find out. And so I kept writing, and pretty soon after that, I realized that I wasn't writing about a woman who believed she could communicate with her dead daughter. I was writing about a woman who believed she could bring her dead daughter back. Creepy stuff, I know. And so it was around that time that I'm writing this, and I had this revelation. I'm like, wow, this book has taken a whole different turn, that I remembered my two sisters with the missing parents idea. And that hit me really strong. And I was like, wait a minute, they belong in my book. They're going to live in this woman's house in the present day. And they're going to wake up one morning and discover that their mother's missing. And it's going to somehow be tied to what happened with Sara all these years ago. And it was just this magical moment. And being a writer, once in a while, I have these magical moments where everything just kind of comes together and all the ideas kind of mesh. And it's just like, wow, serendipity, this is so cool. And so then I just kept on going and told my story, and it was wonderful. So yeah, I think that what I'm going to do is I will read a little something. I will read one of my favorite creepy scenes, dun dun dun. And I wrote, Zella, my daughter Zella, is really excited about this. This is she hasn't heard the whole thing. She's heard bits and pieces of it, but it's pretty creepy. I wrote the first draft of this, actually. I was doing a writing workshop at a high school, and they were doing a unit on, I think they had a humanities class, and they were doing a unit on fear. And they had read my first book, Promise Not to Tell, and I went into this high school class, and we're all talking about the things that scare us. And then as the writing exercise we all sat down, and we were supposed to write a very scary scene and try to use all of our senses and think about how we feel and what we hear and what our body's going through, and what does fear taste like and that kind of thing. So I ended up writing a very rough draft of this chapter in that workshop, and here we go. So the 1908 backstory, Sara and Gertie's story, is I'm losing all my notes, is told mostly through Sara's diaries, but there are also parts from Martin's point of view, which I had a lot of fun with, and I came to really love Martin. And Martin's point of view provided an important balance, because Sara is on this journey and believes certain things, and Martin believes that his wife might be descending into madness. She's saying all these she's suffered this horrible loss, and for a while she's just not eating or sleeping, and she's just not doing well, and then she starts acting just plain crazy, and he just gets more and more worried about her throughout the book. So this particular chapter is told from Martin's point of view, And let's see, what else do we need to know? This is 12 days, about 12 days after the death of Gertie, their little girl. And Martin's very worried about Sara. Years ago, they lost an infant son, their infant son Charles, and I think he's mentioned in this chapter. And the only other thing you need to know is that Lucius, who I mentioned, is Martin's brother and the town doctor. All right, here we go. Martin, January 25th, 1908. The noise woke him sometime after midnight. A scratching, a scuttling. His eyes shot open, and he lay in the dark, listening. Pale moonlight came in through the bedroom's frost-covered window, giving everything a bluish glow. He stared up at the plaster ceiling, listening. The fire had died down. The room was cold. He inhaled, then exhaled, feeling as if the room were breathing with him. There it was again, the scratching, nails against wood. He held his breath and listened. Mice? No, too big for mice. It sounded like something large trying to claw its way out of the walls. Behind the scrabbling, he heard what sounded like the rustle of flapping wings. He thought of the chicken he'd found in the woods this morning, another one of their hens taken. Only this time it didn't seem like the work of a fox. He found the carcass up near the rocks. The chicken's neck had been broken and its chest had been opened up, the heart removed. He didn't know of any animal that could do a thing like that. He'd buried the body in the rocks, tried to put it out of his mind. His own heart thudding now, he felt the bed beside him, expecting to find Sara's warm body. But the bed was cold. Had she gone into Gertie's room again? Were the two of them hidden under the covers, giggling? No. Gertie was dead, buried in the ground. He remembered the way she'd looked when they hauled her body out of the well, like she was sleeping. Sara, he called. He'd been sick with worry over Sara these last days. She'd stopped eating, would not leave the bed, would not feed or wash herself. She seemed to get weaker and less responsive with each passing day. Honestly, there's nothing we can do but wait, Lucius told him. They had been standing in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. Keep trying to get food and water into her. Give her the tonic. Offer whatever comfort you can. I keep thinking about when we lost Charles, Martin said, how sick with grief she was. He didn't want to say what he was thinking, not even to his own brother. This time it was worse. This time, he feared, she might not come back to him. It was one thing to lose poor Gertie, but if he lost Sara too, his life would be over. I don't want to frighten you, Martin, Lucius said, but if she doesn't come around soon, I think it might be best if we send her to the state hospital for the insane in Waterbury. Martin's whole body went rigid. It's not a terrible place, Lucius said. They have a farm. The patients get outside every day. They would keep her safe. Martin shook his head. She'll get better, he vowed. I'll help her to get better. I'm her husband. I can keep my own wife safe. But as far as he could tell, Sara was growing worse with each passing hour. And now, here it was the middle of the night, and she was missing. Sara? He called once more, listening. And there it was again, the scratching, tapping, fluttering. Louder this time, more frantic. He sat up, scanning the room in the darkness. He could make out the edge of the bed, the dresser to his left, and there, in the right corner, a form hunched, moving slightly, pulsating. No, breathing. It was breathing. The scream stuck in his throat, coming out as only a hiss. He looked around frantically for a weapon, something heavy, but then the thing moved, raised its head, and he saw his wife's long auburn hair shine in the dim moonlight. Sara, he gasped, what are you doing? She was sitting on the floor in front of the closet, wearing her thin nightgown, her bare feet as pale as marble against the dark floor. She was shivering. She did not move, did not seem to even hear him. Worry gnawed at his insides like an ugly rat. Come back to bed, darling. Aren't you cold? Then he heard it again, the scratching, claws against wood. It was coming from inside the closet. "Sara," he said, standing on shaking legs, blood pounding through his head, making a roaring sound in his ears. The room seemed to shift around him, growing longer. The distance between himself and Sara felt impossibly far. The moonlight hit the closet door. He could see it move slightly, the knob slowly turning. "Move away from there," he cried. But his wife sat still, eyes fixed on the door. "It's our Gertie," she said calmly. "She's come back to us." Ta-da, and that is the end of the chapter. So, so Sara believes she has brought Gertie back, and Martin thinks she's kind of gone around the bend, and the story goes on from there. But yeah, if folks have questions, I'd love to try to answer them. Anything goes. Throw it out there. Questions? Comments? Zella has a question. Of course she does. See, she sits in the front row. She has a question. What is your question?
How did Gertie die?
Oh, I can't tell you that. That's a secret. She wants to know, how did Gertie die? And you have to read the book, but you have to be a little older. But it does, yes. It says she was pulled out of the well, but yes. That was a little spoiler. Yes?
Since you write such creepy novels,
Mm-hmm.
do you ever have trouble falling asleep at night?
Oh my gosh, yes. So the question is, since I write creepy novels, do I ever have trouble falling asleep? And I am a terrible insomniac. I do. I have trouble falling asleep, and then I'll fall asleep and I'll wake up from a bad dream and I won't be able to go back to sleep. So I will do two of the worst things you can do. I'll get up and I'll turn on the light and I'll start writing about my creepy dream, which takes me to even darker places. Or I turn on the radio and listen to crazy AM late night talk radio, which fills my head with all kinds of other crazy stuff. There's a show that I listen to that starts, I think, at 1 in the morning. It's called Coast to Coast. And people call in from all over the country, and they have guests on. They have ghosts on. They do have ghosts on as well. They have guests on talking about ghosts and the spirit world and alien abduction and conspiracy theories and all kinds of wild stuff. And I love it. It's an insomniac's dream. I absolutely love it. But then, then it's suddenly almost 5 in the morning, and it's almost time to get up, and I might as well just make some coffee and be up. But so I do have trouble. And I really, honestly, when I'm writing, I sometimes scare myself when I'm writing. I'm actually, for someone who writes scary stuff, I scare very easily. I'm kind of a wimp. When I watch a scary movie or read a scary book, I get pretty intensely scared, and I have to sleep with the lights on and don't want to go up to bed. I'm like, oh, I make sure there's a flashlight next to my bed, and anytime I hear a noise. And when I was a kid, a lot of kids have the fear of the closet. And I totally had that, and I still have that, and I ended up putting it in my book. And the really cool thing about being a writer is I get to share my fears with the world, and and invite people to revisit their own childhood fears of the closet. I think a lot of us were afraid of the monster under the bed, or what was in the closet at night. So, yeah. Other questions? Anything? Questions? Thoughts? Comments? Yes.
I guess out of all of the books you've written, is there one character that sticks out as a favorite?
Oh, that's a hard question. Of all the books I've written, is there one character who sticks out as a favorite? Oh gosh. I love Sara so much in this book. Right now she's probably my favorite, but my favorite of all time might be Kate, who is my protagonist in Promise Not to Tell, just because that was my first book, and I have such a soft spot in my heart for the first book, and there was a lot of me in Kate, I think. So, but there's a lot of me in Sara too, in spite of her supposed madness. You have another question? Yes.
I forgot what it was going to say.
Oh, that's okay. Anyone else have other questions? Todd has a question, I bet. Something he's dying to know.
Actually, I do have a question. I was thinking about this.
Awesome.
I hope it wasn't asked already because I didn't hear the first ones. But how did you get your first agent?
Oh boy, that's how much time do we have? that is a long, complicated story. So a long time ago, I studied poetry at Goddard College as an undergrad. And then I went to Vermont College, which is now Vermont College of Fine Arts in Montpelier, to study poetry. And I was really into poetry, and one day I was writing a poem, and it got longer and longer, and I realized it's a prose poem, no, it's a short story, no, it's a novel, oh my God, I'm writing a novel. I don't know a thing about writing a novel. I've been studying poetry for 5 years. What do I know about plot and character development? And I'm lost. So I decided to take time away from the MFA program and work on this novel. So I worked on this novel, and I was working full time, and I got up early, and I went to the cafe, and I wrote before, and I wrote after, and I finished this novel. And I was so proud of myself because I'd finished a novel. You know, it's the thing that so many people want to do, and I thought it was a good novel. And I said, well, what do I do? I have to get an agent. So I went through a guide to agents, and I picked my top 10, and I decided I was going to send out queries in batches of 10. And I don't even think I had email back then. I think that it was all, I mailed everything out. So I send out letters to the first 10 agents. And one of my top agents writes me back almost immediately and says, send me more. So I send it to her, and then, you know, she eventually reads the whole book, and she calls me, and she's a very reputable agent, and she calls me up and just gushes and says she loves this book. It's wonderful. She wants to represent me, and I was over the moon. I was so happy. This is great. This is a woman who works in the publishing industry, who's had big name clients, and she loves my book, and yay. So I did a really stupid thing. I went out and quit my job the next day, because I really hated my job. I was kind of looking for an excuse to quit my job, I think. And I knew that any day now she was going to sell this book, and they were going to want a second book, and I wanted to devote myself to writing and write this second book. So I quit my job. I started working on the second book. My agent starts shopping the first book around, and it doesn't sell, and it doesn't sell, and it doesn't sell. And every month she sends me in a manila envelope a stack of rejection letters from different editors at different publishing houses. They're Xerox copies. So I get them, and none of them, you know, you hope that like everyone would say the same thing, like the characters suck or the plot doesn't make any sense, but they all said completely random different things, so I wasn't learning anything from these letters. But it didn't matter, because it was okay, because I was writing the second book, and it was really good. So I finished the second book, and I sent it to my agent, and by now almost a year has gone by, and she hasn't had any luck. So she reads it, and I don't hear from her for a little while, and then she calls, and she says, well, Jennifer, it's a bit dark, but I'm going to try to sell it. I said, great, okay. So she puts the first book on the shelf, starts shopping the second book around. I start to work on the third book, because I'm a writer, and writers write, and this is going to happen anytime, so I start writing, and I write the third book. And the second book, of course, doesn't, you know, I get the same stacks of rejection letters. None of them are making any sense. The third book is just a complete mess. I decided to challenge myself and write this like multi-generational family saga, and it was such a mess. I didn't show it to anyone. I don't even think I showed it to my partner, Dre. I think I just shoved it in a drawer. I was like, I'm so ashamed of this. It's horrible. So by now, time had gone by. It was almost 3 years, and I'd written 3 books, and nothing really was happening. And it was time for me to, like, you know, do something. And I said, well, book 4 has to be the one. And if it's not, then I'm going to quit this writing thing, and I'm going to go back to work, and I'll do whatever. I'll go work at McDonald's if I have to. And the whole time, my partner, Dre, is supporting me waitressing. And we're living in this little house we're building ourselves out in the woods and really roughing it, and I'm writing. And so book 4 is going to be the one. And I asked myself, I thought about it for a while, and I was like, I didn't ask myself, what's the book that I think would sell? I asked myself, what is the book you most want to read? And we've been living out in the woods for a while. And as I said, I'm a person who scares really easily. And being out in the woods, I was terrified at night, every single night. Every single noise that we heard, I was sure that it was some like serial killing clown or some mutant wolf hybrid creature coming after me. So I decided that I wanted to write a ghost story and incorporate all of my fears of the woods. So I sat down and I wrote this ghost story, and I was so excited, and it was good, and I knew it was good, and I was so excited. And I finish it, and I'm like, this is the one, this is the one, this is my big breakout book, this one is going to get published, people are going to like this, I know they are. So I send it to my agent, and I don't hear from her, and I don't hear from her, and I don't hear from her. And like a month goes by, and I don't hear from her. And I have these fantasies, and I think, oh, well, she's shopping the book around, and any day she's going to call and say, there's a bidding war, and all these publishers want your book. And eventually I get a letter in the mail, and it's a Dear Jennifer letter. And she says, you know, I'm really sorry. I don't do ghosts. The mystery elements aren't working for me. I haven't had any success selling your other books. It's time that we part company and you find another agent. and I was just devastated. And I drank a lot of tequila and felt very sorry for myself and was impossible to be around for a couple weeks there. And then I dusted myself off and I thought, I've got this book that I really believe in. It's the best thing I've written. So I started sending it out. I cleaned it up, I revised it, and I started sending it out and querying other agents. And I eventually lucked into finding this amazing agent who is my agent to this day, and he read it and loved it. And he was actually working as an assistant for another agent. And he was the one who went through the slush pile and went through all the stuff and kind of, you know, he was the first reader and said, "Whoa, this is good enough for you to read, Simon." And before he even passed it on to his boss, the agent, he and I revised it. He said, you know, I think this is good, but I've got some ideas for ways to make it even better before I pass it on to my boss. And I said, great, tell me your ideas. So we did these revisions and we worked really well together, and I loved his ideas. And then his boss actually ended up passing, but by then he was taking on clients of his own because it was all a long process. And he's been my agent ever since. And yeah, his name's Dan. That was Promise Not to Tell, then called The Potato Girl. And he's been my agent ever since, and I am where I am because of Dan and his belief in me, for sure. So it's all about perseverance. That's what I tell people. You know, I almost gave up a million times, but I didn't. And
Did he read your earlier work?
you know, some of them, yes, not all of them. The third book, the one that was really bad and that I didn't show anyone, I ended up finally getting the guts to show him. And it became my I ended up throwing over half of it away, but it became my second book, Island of Lost Girls. And he read it and he said, you know, you're right, it is a mess, but I think that if you read through it, you need to ask yourself, whose story is this? And once you do that and figure out whose story it is, I think you've got something good here. And I did, and I realized what the story was. It was kind of hidden in all the muck. But yeah. You have another question. Okay.
What was your first book called?
My first book that was published, Promise Not to Tell. But originally it was Potato Girl. And then it was changed to Promise Not to Tell. That was the first book I wrote. Oh, the first book that I wrote that was never published? Oh gosh. I don't know what I called it. Do you remember what it was called? It had a bad title. It doesn't even stick in my brain now. Something about Edmund. Edmund Rising, Edmund. It was a bad title. I was young and I didn't know any better. Each book really, it's a learning experience. You know, I learned so much from each book, and this one I learned a lot from. This was my first book that I really did a historical piece in. I was so intimidated, you know, doing the 1908 storyline. I was scared. I didn't think I could pull it off, and I spent a lot of time doing research and reading old diaries and looking at old pictures and studying town histories from back then, and kind of comparing. One of the things I do in the book is this fictional town of West Hall, Vermont. I compare West Hall in 1908 to West Hall now, today, and I have some scenes, you know, showing the same buildings and the same street and the same gazebo in the center of town. And I had a lot of fun doing that, and I definitely did a lot of research about then and now in towns. Yeah. And so I spent a lot of time reading. Yes?
Do you still write like you did at the beginning, churning out book after book? Is it still that same process now, like writing book after book, or do you allow time in between?
I'm always writing. I'm always writing, and I always have a zillion ideas, you know, and I actually just turned in a draft for my next book before this, like a couple weeks ago, before Winter People hit the shelves, but it's really messy. And I'm already thinking ahead to the next one and the one after that. I've got books in varying stages of completion. You know, there's a pressure and an expectation, and people really want me to do a book a year, but if I can't turn out a book that I'm proud of every year, then it's not going to happen. So we'll see. You know, but I'm always working. You know, even when I've turned in my next book to my editor, and I'm working on the one after that, and I'm drawing pictures, and I'm doing brainstorming, and I've got my characters, and I'm starting to pull more ideas together for it. Yes?
This is kind of similar to that question, but do you have a ritual when you write?
A ritual when I write.
Just kind of like write all the time in different things, or do you?
I don't really have a ritual. I'm not that organized. I'm not organized enough to have a ritual. When I first was writing, I had like all these superstitions about like I needed to be in a special place, and I needed to light a candle, I needed all that stuff. And then I had a child, And, you know, when I was pregnant, I thought this is going to be perfect. You know, I'm going to have this baby and the little one's going to play contentedly by my feet when I write. And that's not the way it works. Anyone who's even been around kids knows that. And so I learned to write when and where I could. And I also, it was great because I learned to write with a lot of distraction. And now I can write in a busy airport. I can go to a really busy cafe and there's complete chaos around me and I can just get lost in my own little world. So I don't need to be in any particular place. You know, there are things that I do when things aren't working that are kind of like ritual for me, I think. And one of the things I do is, you know, I do most of my writing on a computer, but sometimes if that's not working and I get stuck, I go back to the old pencil and paper. Not even a pen, I love my pencils. And I've got I've got the old school composition books. I love them. I have one, I carry one with me wherever I go, and I'm always scribbling notes. And if I'm stuck if I get sick of looking at the computer and I'm not going anywhere with it, then I'll pull out the pencil and paper. And actually, when I was doing Sarah's journal entries, I wrote a lot of those out by hand. And it was interesting because I'd been reading all this stuff about spiritualism and about spirit writing and stuff. And then when I got that line, the first time I saw a sleeper, it was a little bit like the whole spirit writing concept. I was like, wow, where did that come from? That wasn't from me. That was from somewhere else.
Well, I wonder about the technology, you know, that you said like now you're using the computer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you save your revisions?
Do I save? Yeah, I have many drafts of every book. I save everything.
Do you save it electronically? Do you print it out and then?
I both, because each time I do a draft, I end up printing it out and I save those. Eventually they get recycled just because they're filling up my office, and I have like 6 drafts of each book probably by the time I'm finished, and they're a mess. The way that because I work without an outline and I have no idea where I'm going, I write a really messy, crazy, sprawling first draft that doesn't make any sense at all. And I don't even know what the story is sometimes. And I kind of go from beginning to end. And I'm like, wow. And then I take it and I lay it out chapter by chapter around the floor of my house. And I walk around and I look at it and I think about it. And I start moving chapters around and I start like realizing where the holes are. I'm like, well, that doesn't belong there and this doesn't belong in the book at all. And oh no, this needs to happen here. And I'll kind of fill in missing pieces, and it's almost like doing a collage, moving things around. And then I start to get what the story really is. And then I sit down and I make the outline. And I realize what I need to do, and I have sort of the bones of what the story will be.
So you're really writing, and the characters are writing the book, really.
Yeah, I think they are. You know, the characters are telling me their stories.
Right.
I'm asking them to tell me their stories, and I'm just listening and taking notes as I go along. And sometimes they have surprises, and that's wonderful. That's when the writing is most exciting, is when they surprise me, and everything turns completely upside down. Like, whoa! But you know, and I meet these people who are big outliners and who have everything completely spelled out, and they know exactly where they're going, and that sounds so boring to me. But it works for them, and that's great. But that sounds really. But I think their outlining process is like that. Their outlining process is the creative. Like anything can happen, and you're really surprised. My third book, Dismantled, my editor asked me for an outline, and I wrote this 13-page outline, and it took me more time to write this outline than it would have to do a draft of the book. I agonized over this thing, and I was so bad at it. And I kept turning in drafts to my agent, and he said, well, it's not quite there yet, and this is really weak. I'm like, oh, I hate outlines. And so finally I get this outline, and my agent says, oh, this is good. Let's hand it to the editor. So we hand it to the editor. The editor's like, yes, we want this book. This is great. Go ahead, start writing. So I put the outline next to the computer, and I'm looking at it, and I've got the blank screen with the blinking cursor, and I'm writing, and I was so bored. And I was completely like, I felt totally boxed in by this outline, and it had taken all the fun out of it. So I took the outline, and I threw it away, and I just wrote a completely different book. The book took a different turn completely, and I handed it in to my editor. She said, this wasn't in the outline, and this wasn't in the outline. And I said, I know, but isn't it better? And she said, yes. And I said, see, I can't outline. So, yeah, but I do need to outline later when I'm going back to make sure, because my books are a little complicated, especially all my books kind of take place in more than one time period, and that gets confusing, and I need the outline to refer to. Yeah. And yeah, this book in particular, I had outlines, and I had charts, and I had maps. I drew maps of West Hall and the farmhouse area in the present day and what it looked like in 1908, and I had named all the streets and figured out where everyone lived and how far it was from this place to this place.
You have like a series, and you have to remember what you.
Oh, I couldn't do that. No, I couldn't be. I'm not that organized.
George R.R. Martin, the Song of Fire and Ice guy.
Oh yeah.
He has a guy that all he does. This guy is keep track of what color the horse
See,
was. what color somebody's eyes were.
Yeah, I would need that guy to
Yeah.
like move into my house and.
They reached 800 pages.
Yeah.
Now you remember, you can't remember that.
Yeah, no, I don't have the attention span to even do a sequel, I don't think. And I feel like once I've put my characters through what I've put them through, I have to let them be and let them recover and let them go on and live their lives. I can't torture them anymore. Anyone have anything else? Other questions? No?
Do you have time to read? Do you have like any authors that really inspire you?
Do I have time to read? I do have time to read. I always make time to read because reading is so important. I have so many authors I love. I still love Stephen King. I just read his new one, loved it. I love Joe Hill now.
Yeah.
One of my huge inspirations and someone I go back to again and again is Shirley Jackson. And I love her. I recommend her to everyone. And then every now and then I meet someone who hasn't read Shirley Jackson. I'm like, go right now. Read some Shirley Jackson. Read The Haunting of Hill House. See, you haven't read Shirley Jackson. Have you read Shirley Jackson? Maybe when you were in school you read a short story called The Lottery. Oh, it's amazingly spooky, atmospheric, haunting stuff. Oh my gosh. And she lived in Bennington. And when you read The Lottery and then you go to the town green in Bennington, that's kind of the setting. Yeah. Creepy stuff. Yeah, I think her husband taught there. And she lived in Bennington, Vermont for a while. Yeah. But she's wonderful, wonderfully creepy. Huh. Yes?
Do you think any of your books could translate well to being made into a movie?
I would love it if that would happen. I don't know if it would translate well. It's interesting. My first book, Promise Not to Tell, I sold the rights to, and I actually just recently read a script, and it was a whole bizarre experience first of all, I don't read many scripts, and I don't know really much about the whole process, other than that it's completely different than novels. But it was like a distilled version of my book. It was really kind of weird, and I mean, it was well done, I thought. It was a movie I would want to go see, but it was a little weird. Yeah, knowing, I've just lived with the characters for so long and knew them in my own way. It's like, and to see them on the screen I think would be a little disconcerting and strange. But I would love it if it would happen, And my fourth book, Don't Breathe a Word, was optioned, and they're supposedly maybe turning that into a miniseries, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. It's a whole other world, the whole TV movie world that I know nothing about, but good things. If anything can get out there to get my stories to more people and will make people want to read the books more, that's great, yay. But it might be hard. They've done a wonderful job so far with all my audiobooks, but I've never managed to get through a whole audiobook of mine listening because it just weirds me out a little. I think that I'd probably, it's like I hear the characters' voices so much in my head, and hearing someone else do the accents and the voices, it's kind of weirds me out. So I think that if I did go to see a movie, if a movie were made of one of my books, I'd be like, oh, I don't know. But it would be a great honor, and I would love it. Anything else? No? Well, thank you all so much for coming, and I'd be happy to sign books, or if you have any last-minute questions, come on up and ask. Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.